Google just walked away from Windows. Not loudly, not with a press conference or a viral announcement, quietly, methodically, in the way that only a company with enough leverage to not need your attention does something world-changing, and almost nobody caught it. This is not about Chromebooks. This is not about Chromos sitting in classrooms and being dismissed as a toy operating system for students who cannot afford a real laptop. This is about Google, one of the most powerful technology companies on the planet, making a calculated, internal decision to remove Windows from its own operational infrastructure. And when a company that size makes that call internally, it does not stay internal for long. Here is what most people miss about this story. Google has been running its own Linux-based internal operating system called Gonzo Linux for years. Gonzo is not a product. It is not something you can download or buy. It is the operating system that Google's own engineers, product managers, and internal staff use on their work machines every single day. It is a custom Linux distribution built entirely around Google's internal tools, Google's security requirements, and Google's way of operating at scale. The fact that it exists is not new. What is new is what Google has been doing with it over the past 18 months. Google has been quietly but systematically expanding Gonzo Linux deployment across departments that were previously on Windows. Teams that handled Windows-dependent workflows were migrated. Compatibility layers were built. Internal tooling was rewritten. The Windows footprint inside Google has been shrinking deliberately, methodically, without any external announcement, because Google does not need to announce anything. They just need to finish. That silence is the tell. When a company this large makes a platform decision this significant and says nothing publicly, it means one of two things. Either the decision is not ready to be defended, or the decision is already so complete that defending it is unnecessary. Given what the internal signals show, it is the second one. But here is where this stops being a story about Google's internal IT decisions and starts being a story about the entire industry. Google does not make operational decisions in isolation. Their infrastructure choices ripple outward through every company in their ecosystem. Every major cloud customer running Google Cloud Platform, every enterprise using Google Workspace, every developer building on Google's APIs and SDKs. When Google standardizes internally on a Linux-based environment, their external tooling, their developer documentation, their SDK support, their testing infrastructure, all of it gets optimized for Linux first. Windows support does not disappear overnight. It just becomes the second priority. And in technology, second priority is a slow death sentence. The developer community already feels this. The most widely used development environments, VS Code on Linux, Docker on Linux, WSL, existing at all, are signals that the development world has been moving toward Linux as its native environment for years. Google, accelerating that internally, does not create the trend. It confirms that the trend has already reached the top of the industry. Enter the enterprise consequence that nobody is discussing yet. Google Workspace has been systematically replacing Microsoft 365 inside organizations for a decade. Gmail replaced Outlook. Google Docs replaced Word. Google Meet replaced Teams. Each individual replacement seemed minor. Taken together, they represent the dismantling of the primary reason most enterprise users needed Windows at all. If your email, your documents, your video calls, and your file storage all run in a browser, the operating system underneath the browser becomes almost irrelevant. Google understood this before Microsoft did, and they built the entire workspace ecosystem around that insight. The moment Google confirmed internally that their own workforce could operate entirely on Linux without meaningful productivity loss, they handed every enterprise IT director in the world a documented proof point, not a white paper, not a vendor pitch, the actual operational reality of one of the most productive engineering organizations on Earth running without Windows. That proof point is more dangerous to Microsoft than any competitor product. Launch. Here is what the financial picture looks like underneath all of this. Microsoft's enterprise revenue depends heavily on two things: Windows licensing fees and Microsoft 365 subscriptions. The licensing fees are already under pressure from the Linux migrations happening across European governments. France's 2.5 million device migration alone represents a 9-figure licensing revenue hit. Germany, Italy, Austria, all running the same math and arriving at the same answer. But the Microsoft 365 threat is newer and potentially larger. Every organization that moves from Microsoft 365 to Google Workspace removes both the licensing dependency and the Windows dependency simultaneously. You do not need Windows to run Google Workspace. You need a browser. That browser runs on Linux. That Linux runs on hardware that does not require a Microsoft license. The unbundling is happening. Google is both accelerating it and demonstrating that it works at scale. Microsoft has responded the way they always respond. They have made Windows more aggressive about integrating their own cloud services: Azure, OneDrive, Teams, Copilot, Every update tightens the connection between the operating system and Microsoft's revenue-generating cloud layer. The logic is straightforward. If users cannot leave the cloud services, they cannot leave Windows. If they cannot leave Windows, the licensing fees continue. But that strategy has a critical vulnerability. It assumes users want to stay. The data says otherwise. Windows 11 adoption has been significantly slower than Windows 10's. User satisfaction scores are down. The communities of people who have already switched to Linux report not going back at rates that should concern. Microsoft's retention teams, the Steam Deck, put Linux gaming hardware in the hands of millions of people who had never considered Linux before, and most of them discovered it worked. European governments are leaving and documenting the savings publicly. And now Google, the company whose products most enterprise users interact with more than any Windows native application, has confirmed internally that Windows is not necessary for operating at the highest level of the industry. The compounding effect of all these signals happening simultaneously is what Microsoft cannot address with a single product update or a single rebranding cycle. Each individual signal could be dismissed. The French government migration is a political decision. The Steam Deck is a gaming device. Linux adoption is a hobbyist trend. Google's internal OS choice is an engineering curiosity, but they are not individual signals. They are a coordinated shift happening across gaming, government, enterprise, and now the internal operations of one of Microsoft's most direct competitors. The foundation is not cracking in one place. It is cracking everywhere at once. What happens next is not a mystery. It follows the same pattern that ended Nokia's dominance and BlackBerry's grip on enterprise mobile. Dominant positions do not collapse from a single competitor beating them head. They collapse from the slow accumulation of alternatives that remove every reason users had for staying. Game compatibility on Linux, removed by Proton. Driver quality on Linux, removed by AMD and increasingly by NVIDIA. Peripheral software on Linux, being removed by browser-based tools. Government-scale proof of viability, being provided by France and Germany. Enterprise-scale proof of viability, just provided by Google. The last argument standing for Windows is inertia. People stay because they have always stayed, because changing is uncomfortable, because the path of least resistance runs through the familiar. That argument is powerful. It kept Windows dominant for 30 years. But inertia has a limit, and the limit is reached when the cost of staying becomes higher than the cost of leaving. For European governments, that limit was reached when Microsoft raised licensing fees while the Cloud Pay Act made their data legally accessible to foreign governments. For developers, that limit is being reached as Linux becomes the default environment for every tool they use. For enterprise users, that limit approaches with every Google Workspace migration that removes the last Windows-dependent workflow. Google abandoning Windows internally is not the cause of what is coming. It is the confirmation that the people with the most information, the deepest technical understanding, and the least tolerance for operational inefficiency have already run the numbers, and they chose Linux. The only question left is how long it takes before that choice stops being remarkable and starts being obvious. What is your number? Drop it below.